Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards with UW Extension. I'm located in Goshen County near Torrington. And my co-host today, as always, well, nearly always, is Jeremiah Vardaman. He is extension educator up in Powell, Cody area. And well, I'll get there just a second. Also, with us today, as always, is Jenny Thompson. She is a host as well. You may not see her, you may hear her as we go along today. And she keeps us straight and keeps us on track. And finally, our guest today is Dorothy Tuthill. She is the Associate Director for the Biodiversity Institute and located in Laramie, Wyoming. Hello, Dorothy. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We are very glad to have you here today. And if you can't tell by our backdrop, our topic today is wildflowers. And we'll get to Dorothy in just a moment. For those of you joining us on Zoom, if you have questions or comments, please use your cursor and scroll over the Zoom platform. And at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A or a chat box, and you can interact with us using either of those two buttons. If you are following us on Facebook Live, please use the comment section to enter your questions, and Jenny will push those questions forward to us. So, Jeremiah, without a significant pregnant pause, did I do okay today?
Yeah, no, you nailed it. We're ready.
I got stuck there for a minute, but we'll get through it. Dorothy, again, welcome to you for being with us today again. And we are going to spend some time talking about wildflowers. And these are mostly flowers or all flowers native to Wyoming, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
We have plenty of flowers that aren't native, but we'll stick with the native ones today.
Okay. All right. Please, if you would like to start into your program, please do so.
Okay, I'm feeling a little bad because I don't have wildflowers behind me here in my office, but it's okay.
But you
Hopefully
do have
everybody will go outside and look at some in real life pretty soon, because this is a great time of year to be out. We've been stuck inside for far too long. Winter always drags on and on here, but there are a lot of things starting to bloom outside now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, not everybody is as fortunate as Jeff and I and have our offices outside where we can see flowers every day. But.
Yeah. You're also, I guess, lucky because you don't live in Laramie. You live where it's a little warmer.
There is that. That does have
a little longer than we have here. So I have quite a few slides, and we'll just kind of start and talk about those flowers, if that sounds okay.
So, yeah, sure, Dorothy, but before we get into that, will you please provide us a little bit more information about yourself and what it is that you do for the Biodiversity Institute?
Well, and for some of us, what is the Biodiversity Institute?
Yes.
So the Biodiversity Institute is a unit at the University of Wyoming. We've been around for almost 10 years now. And the mission of the Biodiversity Institute is really to talk about research that goes on at the university and to increase people's knowledge and appreciation for biodiversity in the state and region and world. So I'm a product of the Department of Botany here. That probably doesn't surprise you, but what is surprising is I actually didn't study plants when I was in the botany department. I studied soil microfungi. So I did that for 20 years. And then when I came over here to the Biodiversity Institute, I discovered that it's a little hard to talk to people about microscopic things that are living in the soil. And it's a whole lot easier to talk about plants.
Sure.
And so I've really enjoyed telling people about the diversity and value of plants in our landscapes. Of course, it's hard to say that I know a whole ton about plants. We have almost 3,000 different kinds of vascular plants in this state, but I know some of them, and I know some stories about them that I enjoy sharing.
That you're willing to share today.
Yes.
Okay.
If you want me to talk about all 3,000, then we'll just stay here for a month or two.
That'll take a little while.
Yeah.
Now, with the Biodiversity Institute, do you guys put any publications out or any newsletters or anything that way if people want to connect with what you guys have going on?
Well, we have a website, which is wyomingbiodiversity.org.
And we highlight at the end of the show, as we always do.
Yeah. And we do put out publications now and then. In fact, our very first publication was Plants with Altitude that we did with Extension, and Jenny Thompson is one of my co-authors. And we have various other publications. You can find all those at our website on bees and mussels and aquatic macroinvertebrates and a variety of other topics.
And one of your recent ones was a pollinator guide.
Yeah, it was the guide to the bees of Wyoming.
There we go. Yep, the bee guide. Great.
Yep.
Great. Well, let's talk about flowers.
Okay. So I'll bring up my screen and we'll talk about a flower that hopefully people have seen. Okay, does everybody see that now?
There it is. Yep.
Okay.
It is there.
Good. So this is a large picture of a small plant, Hood's phlox. It's found all over the state, and it's found from dry basins up to high elevations. It's about, half an inch tall or so. So these are pretty small flowers that you're looking at here.
Now, this is probably one of our first flowers that starts popping out in the springtime. Would that be right?
That's right. Yeah, it makes me happy. It's my happy plant because it's one of the first ones out there.
And phlox is a large group of plants, right? There are many found native, and then folks can also plant phlox in their landscaping, correct?
That's right. So the phloxes that you'll find at the local nursery for your garden are quite tall. They're not derived from native species. Ours are generally quite short.
Would these be more in the creeping phlox type variety? So there's tall phlox and then there's creeping phlox.
Yeah. Well, they're certainly more like those creeping phloxes.
Okay.
They're still smaller. These are what are called cushion plants. This little Hood's phlox, and the next one I'll show you are cushion plants. In that they never grow very tall. This is an adaptation to really dry and windy habitat. So you can imagine if you're a little tiny plant, it's really important that you keep your moisture so you don't dry out around here. And so this adaptation to stay really small and cushion shaped, right, is a way to keep the moisture close to the leaves. So.
And did you want to talk about the common names and scientific names?
Yeah, this is good place to start, I guess. So Phlox hoodii, I misspelled that, it's hoodii, sorry, is the scientific name, and scientific names are given by a botanist, the first person who describes a plant. So often the genus, in this case Phlox is the genus, hoodii is the species epithet. Those may be provided by different people. The name, you see the name Richardson that follows, that is the person who gave Phlox hoodii its name. And I would tell you something about Richardson, but I don't know anything about who this person is. So we'll talk about some of the other ones later.
But that's essentially the author, if you will, of the name, right?
Yep. So even those of us who like to talk in scientific names don't usually include the author when we give the names. But it's there, it's part of the legal name, so to speak, of this plant.
And so why is the scientific or legal name of a plant so important? Why can't we just go off of the common name?
Well, common names are changed wherever you go. And in fact, from person to person standing next to each other, they can change. So Hood's phlox has another common name, which is spiny phlox. So people don't even agree on necessarily what the common name is. So if we use the scientific name, we usually are talking about the same thing. Now, sometimes that's not always the case, and that's the reason to have the author as really part of the name, because it could be that somebody else used the same name, but they had a different plant in mind when they used it.
I see.
And scientific names are usually in Latin, correct?
That's right. Or They're considered to be Latinized. Anyway.
Latinized, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if you have a language barrier communicating with somebody, you can still talk about particular plants or insects if you are able to talk using Latin names.
That's right. Yep.
So Dorothy, we have our first question. Does Hood's phlox only have white flowers?
Well, I've seen them kind of pale yellowish, but as far as I know, they're pretty much white all the time.
There's some in other parts of the state that I've seen that are actually kind of pinkish, so that's kind of interesting. But the white form seems to be much more dominant, doesn't it, Dorothy?
Yeah.
That's what I was just about to say, Jenny. Up here in the Bighorn Basin, you'll see some that have some of the tinges of pink to them and that, but definitely a lot more white flowers out there than there are the pink.
Do you think that might be a soil response or an environmental response?
Well, so you can grow Hood's phlox in the garden, and so somebody gave me a plant off their property that was a pink one, and I planted it in my garden. It stayed pink, so I assume it's more probably genetic. It just has a little frequency in the population. So you can grow them in the garden. They're rhizomatous, so they'll creep along and they'll pop up, and they have kind of a shallow root system, which a lot of our native plants have a really deep one, so that's a little different.
So what are the distinguishing characteristics or features of Hood's phlox if I wanted to identify this out in the field? You said it was short, so maybe an inch tall?
Yeah, at the most. Sometimes it grows in a big mound, as I say, give it that cushion plant name. If it's growing flat like the one in the picture, it's probably not even an inch tall. So it's really small. You can maybe estimate these flowers are 3/8 of an inch across about. One way to recognize a phlox compared to some of the other plants that might trick you into thinking they're phlox is that everything in the phlox family has 5 petals, and the petals are united at the base. So what we see here are the lobes of the petals, but going down, you can see the yellow stamen sticking up out of the tube, and that tube has all the petals united, so they're in there. So that's Dorothy, a characteristic of that family.
Dorothy, do these bloom only early in the spring, or do they bloom all season long?
They bloom only early, so they're, at least at my yard, they're about done now. When you go up in elevation, you'll see them again.
Okay.
I'm going to go on to the next one because it's very similar. There it is. So this one, you can tell, looks a lot like Hood's phlox, and these will often grow side by side. But this one is it's whiter, and that's because it's got more hairs. And the leaves, those little tiny leaves, are more kind of broken up along the edges of them. They're not as smooth on the edge. So Muskogee means moss-like.
Dorothy, it looks like that one's really adapted to drought and stress, right? What characteristics do you think help plants survive our drought?
That's a good question, Jenny. So again, being short and having all the leaves huddled together keeps the moisture that's constantly evaporating out of the leaves, right? Keeps it close to the leaves so they don't dry out. Shallow root systems collect early spring moisture. So from snow melt, this one will rely on a lot, I'm sure, in early spring precipitations to gather it. But this one will just hunker down. It's, as I say, it's about done blooming. So as the soils dry out, this plant stops blooming, and it is doing most of its growth right now as well. It'll put out seeds very quickly and be done for the season. And that's one of the ways that this plant tolerates drought.
So it also has that kind of silvery color that you see a lot in our Western native plants. Is that part of the adaptation?
Yeah, so the silvery colors on our plants can be heavy wax coverings on the leaves, or it can be hairy surfaces, and both of those help retain moisture into a plant.
Cool. What I think is interesting with plants like these, when they're not blooming, you hardly notice them because they look like rocks.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, and I was going to say, in contrast of your characteristics for drought tolerant and being able to survive here in Wyoming, where we have limited water and nutrients and things like that, in comparison, contrast, right, to tropical plants that have the really big, broad leaves, very erect growth habit, that kind of thing. It's just a big contrast of, you don't want to have that here. Yeah, our winds will dry you out, our soils and everything that we have, our intense heat. Yeah. We have a question. Joyce asked, transplanting native flowers into my landscape for Hood's phlox, do I put it in full sun, and do I need to be concerned about overwatering?
So I've grown it in my landscape. This is Jenny. So first of all, you want to get the plant from like a friend. So don't take it off federal land or any other lands that you don't know, because it's illegal. But if you can find a friend that has some growing, or you have some growing out in your pasture and you want to move it, this one's fairly shallowly rooted, not the Muskogee, but that Hood's phlox. So you can dig it up and transplant it. And then as far as watering, I tend not to water a ton in general, but we do water. So it doesn't seem to kill it off that we're giving it some extra water, but you probably don't really want to dump it on.
Okay.
I've discovered that Hood's phlox really likes to be abused. So the place I have the most of it, I live out in the prairie outside Laramie, is where I used to drive my vehicles on occasion. And it just loved it out there. And now that I don't drive my car back there because I don't have chickens back there anymore, it's kind of going away. So Hood's phlox is a pretty easy one to deal with, but yeah, as Jenny says, don't take too much care of it.
And a lot of our native plants, actually, when you transplant them, often means death for them, because a lot of them are, unlike the Hood's phlox, are fairly deep rooted, and they all have a tap root. And if you bust that tap root off when you're transplanting it, it pretty much is the end of the plant. So you have to be kind of picky about those you choose to transplant.
I usually don't recommend transplanting plants because it's more often just going to lead to the death of the plant if you're not quite sure what you're doing. So both Jenny and I like to collect seeds and grow plants from seed for our gardens.
Yeah, that's where I get most of mine, is from collecting seed and growing them out from there. As she mentioned, that transplanting process, it's a lot easier to grow them from seed, plant seedlings out and have them survive.
Dorothy,
We had another question from Teresa. Is this also called snow on the mountain?
No.
I've never heard it called that. There's a cultivated plant in town that's called snow on the mountain. That's quite a spreader, but I've never heard these called that.
Yeah, I haven't either. But again, common names, you can call them whatever you want, pretty much. So.
Another question. When growing these, this comes from Becky. When growing them out by seed, should you use a special soil?
So we have a section, and I'll bring it up at the end, that goes all through it was with part of Plants at Altitude with Dorothy that we wrote, that talks about how to be successful growing these types of plants from seed. So we'll show that at the end.
Great. Anything else about moss phlox?
I just think it's a really lovely little plant because it is so silvery. As I said, it grows right next to Hood's phlox in some places anyway. So one is green and one is silver, and they're just really nice little plants. So I have one more phlox picture here. So Phlox Multiflora. This one is slightly higher elevation and requires a little more moisture. And you can see I picked a pinkish one here. And in my experience, it's much more likely to be pink than either Hood's or the moss phlox. And this one's quite a bit taller. And so it's easy to distinguish from Hood's phlox because these flowers are, I'm going to say, up to 3/4 of an inch across. The plant's a little bit taller, although again, it is still a short plant with dense foliage underneath it. So one reason I put this picture in, besides the fact that I really like this plant and it's quite abundant in the hills, is that this one was named by a person called A. Nelson. And A stands for Avon. So Avon Nelson was actually a Wyoming botanist, the first of our, I would say, homebred Wyoming botanists. Evan Nelson was hired to come to the university. He was one of the first 5 faculty hired, and he was hired to teach English. But it turned out that their mistake had been made, and of the 5 faculty, 2 of them were English teachers, and they had no biologists. So the other guy who was going to teach English was more qualified to teach English than Evan Nelson was, so he became the biology teacher. And that was really a great thing for Wyoming because he really took to that. And within a few years, he had founded the Rocky Mountain Herbarium, which is still at the University of Wyoming, just celebrated accessioning its 1 millionth specimen.
Wow.
And Evan Nelson traveled quite a lot around the state and did a lot of collecting of plants that weren't all that well known at the time. So this would have been in the 1890s, right? 1880 something is when the university founded, and he came here.
So we have another question, Dorothy, from Tori. Do all phlox smell really good?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe because I don't crawl down on the ground close enough to these to know if they smell. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. At least when I'm out, I see them out in the native landscape, and I don't really notice a fragrance from them, but I also don't get real close to them to find out.
Yeah, I don't notice that they're scented, but that doesn't mean they're not.
Yeah, I haven't noticed either. There's some small, short plants that some folks call belly flowers because you have to lie on your belly to actually look at them up close or to tell if they smell, and this is kind of one of them.
So we've had a few questions in the comment or Q&A box, and people want to know finding information about where to get native plant seeds and where to purchase those at. And I just wanted to let everybody know that that's also in that Plants with Altitude guide, and we will share that here at the end of the session. So great. What's next, Dorothy?
Okay. Oh, well, my slide on Evan Nelson, but I already told you most of that. Except I forgot to mention he also became a president of the university at some point.
Wow.
So here's another flower that I think people should have seen flowering by now. I just saw him this last weekend. The Pasqueflower. This is...
Now this one, to me at least, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but for once it goes to seed, the petals drop off, and then it has kind of these feathery type seed heads on them, and it confuses me with prairie smoke. Is that correct?
Yeah, it does look kind of like prairie smoke. You're right. So in both cases, those feathery appendages to the seeds have to do with an elongation of the styles, which is part of the female reproductive organ.
They always remind me of those Dr. Seuss books with the characters with the crazy hair. So they always make me want to laugh a little bit, which is nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But actually, prairie smoke and Pasqueflower aren't related to each other at all. They're in completely different families. But it is interesting that they both have those real plumed fruits when they're done flowering. Pasqueflowers are kind of cool. Pasque means Easter, by the way. So that's an indication it's an early bloomer. It's really hairy. And you can kind of see that in this picture, right, on both the stems below the flowers and the outside of the, I won't call them petals because they aren't quite, they're usually called tepals because you can't tell the difference in this case between sepals and petals. And they're very hairy too. And this plant, because it flowers so early in the spring, has all that hair to retain heat. So you might not think about plants generating heat like a warm-blooded animal, but in fact, they do generate a certain amount of heat just by the process of breaking down sugars for metabolism. And so that hair will help retain that little bit of metabolic heat as well as any heat that they absorb from the sun. And that helps the plant grow, right? They can grow faster when they're warm. And it also makes them attractive to the early insects that are out because they're attracted to the warmth and they like to linger in there. And at night, these flowers will close up and retain a bit of heat in there. And so sometimes in the mornings, you can look in there and you'll find an insect that's spent the night inside that nice warm flower.
I see bumblebees visit these a lot in the early spring. Those queen bumblebees that come out and are looking for food to start their first brood, you'll see them on these.
Yeah, I imagine this is like the first really showy flower that would get those bumblebees really excited.
And how tall do these flowers get?
Oh, they're 6 to 8 inches, and then they keep elongating so that by the time they have those funny fruits coming up there, they can be 10 or more inches, I suppose. But they're definitely large and showy. These flowers are 1.5 inches across, about.
And they have that nice lavender color on the outside of those. You call them the tepals?
The tepals, yep. And then all those yellow things inside there, those are all the stamens, the male parts. So the yellow things are the anthers with all the pollen. And then right on the inside where it's white, that's the female part. And you can see there's lots of those parts as well. And so this is a characteristic of the buttercup family that this belongs to, that it has lots of reproductive parts on the inside. Oh, and I could say one other interesting thing about this, and it holds true for the entire buttercup family, is that they're all poisonous. So Pasqueflowers have bulbs underground that you might potentially mistake for something edible, but they're not. Don't ever eat Pasqueflower bulbs.
Fair warning.
Use them for ornamental.
So Dorothy, what's the purpose of them being poisonous like that in nature, do you think?
Well, my guess is that being poisonous keeps things from eating them in general, right? So we'll talk about some others later. You might think of eating as like a cow or an elk or something that comes along and munches plants, but of course the vast majority of herbivory on plants is done by insects. And so plants have all kinds of ways to prevent insects from eating them.
Since they can't run away, they use chemical warfare, right?
Yep. Jeff, you want to add anything about insects to this at this point?
No. So I can share a story. Last year, Diana and I went on a nature walk with Jenny and Brian Sabady, and I actually spent more time watching the insects that were visiting the flowers than looking at the flowers. So that's just my nerdism.
Yeah.
To each their own.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about the long-term relationship that plants have with insects, because these flowering plants, at least, are trying to attract insects at certain times of the year to do specific tasks for them. But all the time, they're also trying to keep insects away from them who would eat them up. So it's push and pull with the insects and the plants.
Take care of me, but don't eat me.
Yeah.
So what's our next flower?
Okay, our next one is Rocky Mountain Bluebells. This is the genus Mertensia, and I should have counted how many species of Mertensia we have in the state. I don't know what that is, but it's several. This one is fairly low. It grows up to 6 inches, maybe 8 on a good year, with quite showy upturned flowers. Other bluebells are better known for some of them being quite tall, but the flowers generally hanging down. So although they're all this blue and bluish purple colors, they aren't necessarily as showy as this one is. This one is Humulus, species Humulus, is restricted to certain parts of the state, I understand. It's really abundant in some places down here. Others of you may not have gotten to see it.
I don't know that I've ever seen this one.
Yeah.
It is blooming now, though, correct?
It is, yeah. And this is also very early. It's been blooming for a couple of weeks at least here.
And it would be probably more an elevation thing of where it is in the state, not in the state. Is that correct?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, plants are restricted in their range for a variety of reasons, most of which we don't understand. But this one is kind of a low foothills basin kind of plant. You can see from the background it's growing in a pretty dry spot. But it doesn't grow in dry spots all across the state. It's restricted down here.
I think this is one of the prettiest bluebells. So some of the bluebells, folks call them oyster leaf, right, Dorothy? Why is that?
I never knew that people called them oyster leaf, but I'm sure it has to do with the flavor of the leaf.
That's that common name thing again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they are. They do have edible leaves, and you can put them in salads. To me, they taste like fish, but maybe that's because I don't have much experience with oysters.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to try that.
Yeah.
Just make sure you choose the right plant, Jeremy.
Yeah, as I was going to say, with all native plants, you better know exactly what it is before you try to eat it. As Dorothy
Yeah, well,
mentioned.
you can usually recognize a bluebell though.
Yes,
When you go
can.
up high in the mountains along the creek sides, there's a really tall one.
Yes.
It goes like up to 3 feet tall even. So it has lots of leaves. You can scavenge on those as much as you want.
Sure. Just remember what Dorothy said about there being lots of toxic plants in the state as well. So
Don't
try
need
D
it.
down. What's your next plant, Dorothy?
Oh, my next one is a little violet. And when I'm out with kids in particular, I always just tell them that this is yellow violet and that you should be able to remember that because that name is an oxymoron. But there's a couple of kinds of yellow violets in this state. And this one is Nuttall's violet. And you can tell this from the other yellow violet by leaf shape, basically.
The long spatula type leaf shape is the distinguishing characteristic.
Well, yeah, and it has to do with the angle of the leaf at the base of the leaf.
Oh.
So, I don't remember which is which now, because when I go out to identify plants, I take with me the key to the plants, except for the ones I get to know eventually. So we do have this key called The Vascular Plants of Wyoming, written by Robert Dorn, that can help you identify every known plant in the state. That is every plant that was known in the state in 2001 when the last edition came out. It's not a picture book, and so I don't generally recommend it when people ask me, oh, what's a good flower book? But if you're really serious about getting to know your plants in the state, this is the one that you need because it's got them all, and it'll walk you through how to find out. So for example, in a violet, you would pick first of all that it's got yellow flowers as opposed to violet flowers, right? And then it gets into leaf shape, and sometimes you have to know whether the leaf is lobed or cleft or whatever to help you get to them.
So Dorothy, on the flowers on these, it looks like along with the yellow, it's got little kind of darker colored stripes that go into the throat of the flower. Do those have a purpose, you think?
Those are usually called bee guides. So the idea is that stripes on flowers help the bees find the nectar in there. So,
Landing strips.
Yeah. Well, this is part of this game of trying to get the insects to come do what you want them to do and not do the things you don't want them to do. So many flowers have rewards of nectar to get the insects to come in there. And of course, in trade, they want the insect to pick up some pollen and move it around to another plant so it can fertilize the plants and make seeds. And a lot of plants that are bee pollinated have these lines in them, and it's thought that those help the bees find their way into the middle of the flower where both the nectar and the reproductive parts are. A lot of these flowers, like this is called a zygomorphic flower, meaning it's got bilateral symmetry as opposed to radial symmetry. And it's that bottom petal is kind of big and flat, and that's a landing space, presumably for bees too. So they land there and then they follow the stripes into the middle of the flower and pollinate it and get the nectar.
Cool.
Great. What's our next flower?
Well, before I leave this one, I'll say one of the reasons I picked Nuttall's violet, again, it's one of these nice plants that you see blooming early in the spring, so I like it. But I picked it in part because of the name, Nuttall. So Nuttall was an early plant collector and botanist who came out to the West and starting in the 1830s. to collect plants out here. And so he has probably more plants named after him and more plants that he's named than any other single botanist. So I'm gonna, if you've been watching, you may have noticed that we've had some other Nuttall plants. They're abbreviated with NUTT at the end of the name. So this one is not one that Nuttall named, but one that was named for him because he collected it. And if we have time, I'll tell you a story about Frederick Hirsch.
And is that why this is Viola Nuttallii? I just butchered that name.
Nuttallii, yeah. So the rule about saying scientific names is you look at it and then you say it like you understand how, like you know what you're saying, right?
With confidence.
Yeah. And then if somebody corrects you, you just kind of blow it off. It's like,
since we don't have any ancient Romans to ask about it.
Yeah, well, the rule is that although they're Latinized words, you pronounce them like English when you're in this country. So you just do your best to say them. So you should never be afraid of a scientific name.
We were talking before about the show about many of the plant explorers, that botanists that traveled the United States that discovered plants. And it was pretty amazing the kind of trials and tribulations they went through in their various journeys across the United States. And that includes the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? Meriwether Lewis seems to be mentioned on a number of plants. Is that right, Dorothy?
Yeah. So both Lewis and Clark have genera named after them as well as species. Of course, they didn't come through Wyoming. They were north of here, and so we don't have quite as many. I could have put in a picture of bitterroot, which is the Montana state flower, which is the genus is Lewisia, which is named for Meriwether Lewis. So Nuttall here that I like to talk about was not too much after Lewis and Clark, right? They were in 1806 about. And then starting in the 1830s and the 1840s, there were a lot more expeditions that came west, and those expeditions very frequently brought naturalists with them. And Nuttall was one of those who came in 1834 on his first trip through Wyoming collecting plants. And Nuttall was an interesting character. He was born in England and he was trained as a printer. And he came to North America and he got jobs working in print shops, but really his avocation was plants and he really wanted to travel and collect plants. Unlike a lot of the plant collectors, Nuttall was actually a very good botanist as well. So he was able to collect plants and name them and publish them on his own. And he eventually went east again and became the director of the herbarium at Harvard, a job which apparently he was good enough at, and he had to teach as part of it. He was okay as a teacher, but he didn't like it because he didn't like being tied down. So a job that most of us would love to have, right, and call it our crowning achievement, he quit so that he could go plant collecting again in the West. And eventually he did go back to England because he inherited some land there and had to return.
But he was hoping to needed to have a little bit more space than just that herbarium there. He needed to be out and traveling, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's right. And all of these early plant collectors, they're mostly on foot or boat or sometimes horse, exploring the West, and a lot of them had very small stipends, especially if they were government employees, but Nuttall was off on his own, and he would periodically stop and work at a print shop to earn some money if he was in, say, St. Louis. Yeah, but he really did it on his own for the love of it. And he ended up going as far west as Hawaii at one point.
Wow. And because of his printing background, he was able to publish all of his work.
Yeah.
So that everybody knew what he was up to, right?
Yeah.
That's a good skill to have.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's our next flower?
Okay, well, our next one's Steagle Lily. So I put this one in not because it's blooming yet, because it's a July bloomer, but because this is a plant that was named for Nuttall. And it was named for him by Torrey and Gray, who were Eastern botanists and named a lot of plants too. But they were what were called armchair botanists. So a lot of these plant collectors would come out, including Lewis and Clark, and would send their specimens back east. And it would be those people that would sort through them and name them, et cetera, even though they'd never seen them in the wild.
Hmm.
This is another plant named for Thomas Nuttall. Nuttall's evening primrose. People may have seen this. This is not what most people think of as a lovely flower to put in the garden. It's lanky and weedy and it spreads around your garden. Yet it has very lovely flowers. And like every evening primrose, they open up in the evening. They're scented. They have really deep tubes with nectar at the bottom. So they're pollinated by moths.
Would hummingbirds visit these by chance, or only moths?
Well, I can't speak for all hummingbirds, but these open in the evening and they fade in the morning. So they're not as likely to be visited by hummingbirds, I would say, because they're not open when hummingbirds are out and about.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any. I've seen the hummingbird moths visit the next one that Dorothy's going to show.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's generally considered that it's long-tongued moths that are visiting these. And these you can kind of see the long tubes of the flowers, especially on the ones that are closed. Tell where the nectaries are way down there at the bottom. So this tufted evening primrose is another really drought-tolerant one, grows in really rocky and dry and poor-soiled areas. It also grows in disturbed sites, like you can often see them on the side of the road. So one of the common names for this plant is the toilet paper flower plant. And that's because these large white flowers, again, they open in the evening, they close in the morning, and they just kind of are there and fluttering in the wind. And so if you're driving down the highway and you see these squares of white, you might think they're toilet paper.
65 miles per hour. Kind of look that way. This is one of the prettiest evening primrose, I think. They have the kind of compact shape, but the flowers are huge. They can be up to 4 inches across, and they smell super sweet and lemony. So the person that was asking about the phlox, whether it smells, I don't know about that, but the tufted evening primrose, if you ever have a chance to get out there and smell it, it is marvelous.
Yeah, it's a really nice plant. And notice this plant was named by Thomas Nuttall. You can see the N-U-T-T there. So then I thought I could touch on the Stragalus genus, which are generally called milk vetches. So Stragalus is the most diverse genus in Wyoming other than carex, and carex are sedges. And so if you're like me, all sedges look alike, but all astragaluses look different. So it's much more diverse. So this is one that's in bloom right now outside, Short's milk vetch.
And really small flowers, right?
Well, this one has tiny flowers. So this tufted milk vetch is another one of these little cushion plants. That's maybe an inch tall. So these little flowers are probably 1/2 centimeter or so. Short's milk vetch flowers, that whole flower is an inch. So it's a pretty good sized flower.
So Dorothy, what plant family are these guys in?
These are in the pea family.
And they have a pea flower.
They do have a pea flower. And
so that can help folks with identification. If they see peas growing in their garden or they've seen sweet peas in somebody's yard, the flowers on these guys look very similar, don't they?
Yeah, maybe the other ones shows it slightly better. So pea flowers, if you're not familiar with them, they have 5 petals, but they're arranged in a very unusual way. So they have this one big one that sticks up the top, which is called the banner. And then there's 2 one on each side, so 2 wings. And then the last 2 petals are fused together and they kind of stick out in the front. And they're called the keel. And the keel, as you might guess, is shaped a bit like the front of a boat. And it hides the reproductive structures. So in order for a pea to be fertilized, to be pollinated, an insect has to land on the keel, and the weight of the insect drops the keel down and then exposes the reproductive structures. So milk vetches, there's like 70 kinds at least in the state. That would be species and subspecies and varieties, etc. So they're highly variable. So this little spatulatus is one of the shortest ones. But there's quite a few that are small and that have tiny flowers like this. And then there's others that could make quite large mounds that might be 1.5 feet around. Flowers range from kind of creamy to white to pinks and purples generally.
We have a question, Dorothy. Tori asked, what about those two plants, milk vetch and evening primrose, is tufted?
That's tufted?
Yep,
Yes.
that tufted characteristic.
Oh, so the tufted means without a stem, basically. So tufted evening primrose, it's a little short plant. All the leaves are basal and the flowers stick out, and it's very similar with this tufted milk vetch that's stemless.
So it's not tufted in terms of like having a tuft of fuzz or fur or hairs or anything like that.
No.
Without a stem. Okay.
No, it really has to do with the form of the plant.
Oh, okay. So another question, Short's milk vetch, is it a taproot or a shallow root system?
I wouldn't know for sure, but my guess would be it's probably most likely going to have a tap root. So I think I've dug up, not that one, but some other astragaluses that I've had the pleasure of meeting before had more tappy roots. So they're unlikely to survive any type of transplanting. So if you want to grow them, you can grow them from seed. It's not very hard. Like I said at the end, we'll show you how. And if you transplant them, you can plant them in your garden fairly easily.
Yeah, I've tried to transplant Short's milk vetch, and so I do recall it had a pretty deep root, even though I was digging up the smallest plants I could find, and they did not successfully transplant.
And,
So I think that,
and that answers the question. We had a question from Mary Beth. Can this plant do well with transplanting? So it really just depends on how well you are at getting that full root system up out of the ground will help with the transplanting.
Even then, sometimes the chances of success are slim. So just so you know, like I said, it's actually a lot easier to start a lot of these from seed. So this particular family of plants, those legumes, oftentimes the only trick with them is some of them you need to scarify the seed, which means you need to take something scratchy and rub it against it and kind of scuff up the seed coat because it lets water in. There's some that need that and some that don't. But it's a lot easier to do it from seed.
so being in the pea family, these should also fix their own nitrogen, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I have no evidence one way or the other, but I'm going to assume that law holds. I was going to say, also being in the pea family, their fruits are like little pea pods. So for the Astragalus spatulatus, there's only a couple of seeds in there, but some are much larger. And Short's milk vetch has hard pods with multiple seeds in them. It's really easy to collect those and get the seeds out of them.
I don't know specifically about this tufted milk vetch or the shorty milk vetch, but I know other vetches do fixate nitrogen, Jeff. So it's a good assumption that these could.
Oh, so here's another Stragalus I put in because these are the fruits of this particular painted milk vetch, which this plant has not really discernible leaves. You can kind of see how really slim the leaves are on here, and you don't notice the plant until it makes its pods, and they're really pretty. You'll find these in really dry places. You can see it's growing right on sand, but you won't see them until July probably.
And it looks like those stems are very, very pubescent, have a lot of short, small hairs on them. Is that correct?
Yep, it is. Again, I presume that's to keep moisture in and to keep sun off of it.
Sure.
It looks like it resembles skeleton weed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it does kind of. I mean, so that's an adaptation for growing in these dry climates. So multiple plants have.
And those are probably found in similar locations. Skeleton weed in this.
Yeah, probably. I think so. So closely related to the astragalus is Oxytropis. So also in the pea family. This one, multiceps, is again a really small plant, an inch to an inch and a half tall. And I put this picture in because this one shows the pods in this case that really hairy how the flowers are gone by. And hairy, you can see the hair on the leaves here too, because this one's adapted again to really dry places.
It almost looks like fingers holding on to that leftover or the left of behind flower after it's done it, but they're just holding on to it.
Yep. Yeah, so this one, it grows in pretty round, kind of plate-shaped plants that are usually six inches around, maybe, or across at the most. So cute. It's one of my cute plants. Again, I put it in here in part because it's Nuttall's plant. He named this one. The common name goes to him. And also because it's the more common name for Oxytropis plants rather than oxytrope is locoweed.
Crazy weed, right?
Why would it be called locoweed?
Well, I've never eaten it, but I hear that animals that eat locoweed, well, they get loco because there are alkaloids inside of these plants that cause nerve damage. And that is why ranchers really don't like locoweeds on their pastures. And so I think that purple locoweed is a really pretty wildflower, but this one, the silky locoweed or white locoweed, is the one that's a much more common problem that can grow really densely in pastures. There's interesting stories about these alkaloids. So silky locoweed has the genes in it that produce these alkaloids that damage herbivores. Other locoweeds, like the purple locoweed, don't have those genes. Instead, they have fungi that live inside the plants, and those fungi are producing the alkaloids.
Huh.
So one hypothesis is that at one time, even silky locoweed was associated with a fungus producing alkaloids, but then they essentially stole the genes. The genes moved over from the fungus into the plant, so it can now produce its own alkaloids.
Huh.
So plants do their own genetic engineering, don't they?
Yeah.
So it could be the plant producing the alkaloids, or it could be a fungi in a symbiotic relationship with the plant. But either way, it's within the plant and can be toxic or poisonous to livestock.
That's right. Yeah, either way, it's in there. And so when cattle eat them or sheep, right, then there's problems. This purple locoweed, I don't generally see it growing really densely, but of course, sometimes the silky locoweed does grow really densely and becomes a problem in pastures.
So how do you identify, like, are these, I'm thinking characteristics, identification characteristics of the locoweed. How many petals, or what are the flowers like? Are they similar to the astragalus?
Yes, so again, it's got a typical pea flower to it. There's a feature that unites astragalus and oxytropis is that they have, almost all the time anyway, they have these compound leaves, and you can see it in this picture of the silky locoweed. So one leaf has lots of little leaflets in it. So if you find a pea plant and it's got the right kinds of flowers and it's got these compound leaves and it doesn't have any tendrils growing out of it anywhere, then it's a good guess it's an oxytropis or an astragalus. After that, you have to look more closely because what separates those two genera has to do with the keel. Remember, the keel is those two united petals at the base of the flower. And in oxytropis, there's a little point on that keel and it sticks out. Whereas in an astragalus, the keel is just rounded up more like a canoe. And so that's the first feature you look for to tell which one of these you have.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's not nearly as many kinds of Oxytropis as there are astragalus.
The only way I can remember that little tip about the keels is with the Oxytropis. I always told myself it'll poke your eye out because it's got a sharp little point on it, and Oxytropis rhymes with poke. So that's the only way I can remember. It's super helpful when you're out in the field.
Yeah.
Maybe silly.
Good little silly rhyme, yeah.
Yeah, whatever works.
So what's our next flower? Are we still in the Stragalus family? Oh, no.
Oh,
No.
nice.
So this is Arrowleaf Balsam root, just coming into flower now. This plant grows in the hills, and in my experience, it grows where snow accumulated in the winter times, or kind of around those places where the deep drifts were. On slopes in particular. So it really relies on having a lot of early spring moisture. It comes up, the leaves and the buds come up essentially at the same time and covers the hillsides with large yellow flowers, which are really nice.
Yeah, and then when they dry down, at least for me in the fall, they just are really a noisy plant when you walk through them. Just
Oh yeah, I believe that.
That dry up and curl up, and it just sounds like you're walking through a bunch of leaves. It's
Yep.
an interesting plant, and they're pretty densely on a hillside or a canopy.
Yep, that's right. So this plant, you may be able to tell, is a member of the sunflower family. And what looks like one flower to most of us is actually a head made out of many, many flowers. So the little yellow flowers that you can see, well, let's start at the outside. Right? We see the petals, and each one of those petals belongs to one flower. Those are called the ray flowers. And then inside that ring of ray flowers, we have a whole bunch of disc flowers. And each one of those is very tiny. It has all the parts of a flower. So what you see sticking up around that rim there are the stigma and the anthers. And so each one of these little bitty flowers is like a little cup. So insects love sunflowers because they can land on there and walk around and stick their tongues in each one of those little cups. There'll be a little bit of nectar in there. So it's a great smorgasbord for them. And then each one of those little flowers will make one little one-seeded fruit. So think sunflower seed. What we get when we get it in the shell, that's the fruit called an achene. If you break off the dry shell, there's one seed inside of that. And so all members of the sunflower family produce those kinds of fruits, although we know that sometimes they have plumes on them, like on dandelions.
Great. So these are a composite head, exactly like our sunflowers that we would see.
That's right.
Cultivated field, but they're just a smaller head than typically our sunflowers are.
Yeah, I mean, they're not that much smaller than, say, the annual sunflower that grows along highways, really. They're quite large and showy.
Right. I guess I was thinking of the convection type sunflower heads that get just really enormous.
Yeah, they get huge. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. What's our next one? Oh yeah, Penstemon.
Yep. Had to put in a Penstemon. So this one is probably one of the first blooming ones around here. It's the one that blooms first. And so I like it. I love it. Sky blue flowers. There's all kinds of Penstemons, about 45 species in the state. They all have blue to purple, one pink, a couple white, few white species here. And the common name of Penstemons is sometimes Penstemon, but the other one that you hear is beard tongue. And so we were laughing earlier about the funny common name for this plant, broad beard tongue.
Do you know where that comes from?
I don't know who called it broadbeard beard tongue, but beard tongue is just the common name for Penstemon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the reason they're called beard tongues is if you look closely into the flower, And you can kind of see it in some of these open flowers. There's a thing that looks like a tongue sticking out at the flower. And that's often kind of hairy, and that's the beard tongue. And that's just in the genus Penstemon. So they have 5 petals. You'd expect them to have 5 stamens. Instead, they have 4, and they have this other thing that's technically called a staminode. And it's thought that the staminode may be helping to direct insects into the flower to pollinate, but nobody knows that for sure. And so this one's got a fairly wide tongue. I guess that's why they call it broadbeard.
So the staminode is the beard tongue?
Yep, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't always stick out of the flower like it does in this one, but sometimes it really sticks out and it's bright yellow or things too. It can be very attractive.
And sorry, go ahead, Dorothy.
If you were to just translate the scientific name of this one, you would probably call it narrow leaf penstemon.
And with the penstemons, they come in different sizes as well in terms of height, I guess, is what I'm thinking of, because there's the shell leaf penstemon that is fairly tall, whereas the smooth beard tongue or the narrow leaf beard tongue are fairly, maybe what, 6 or 8 inches?
Yeah, this one will be 6 to 10. The shortest penstemons that grow in this state are only an inch or so, 1.5 inches maybe.
Wow.
And then they get quite tall. And a lot of people may have penstemons growing in their gardens too. Most likely Rocky Mountain penstemon, which can easily grow up to 2 feet or more in the garden.
Some of those short ones grow in Carbon County. We were over there doing a plant walk, and there's some that grow. They're kind of like little carpets along the ground, and I saw one. I got all excited, and everybody was like, "Oh, she's nerding out. She's was having a Penstemaniac moment." But it was super cool. Let me tell you.
So penstemons are sometimes used as a textbook example of a bee-pollinated plant because, again, it's got that bilaterally symmetrical flower. It's got a landing pad for bees, and then they can crawl in there. And some of them, you'll see those guidelines on them as well, although not in this species. But there are some penstemons that are red, and they're easily available for garden plants that are hummingbird pollinated. None of the red ones are native to Wyoming.
Oh, okay. So all the native ones are that blue or violet, purplish hue to them.
Yeah, well, except for, I think there's 3 white ones and a pink one.
Yeah.
So
you did mention, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So I think Jenny and we often agree that this is the best genus.
Yeah.
Oh, and another cool thing, I can brag on Penstemon a little longer, is that this is the largest genus of wildflowers that is restricted to North America. So there's now considered to be almost 400 species all in North America.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of them are in Wyoming, which is super cool.
Yeah.
So what's our next flower?
Oh, our next one is our unusual plant. So you notice it's not green. The green in plants comes from chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is necessary for photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is how plants make sugars for themselves and for every other living creature on the planet, except a few bacteria. So this plant, lacking chlorophyll, is unable to photosynthesize. So it has to get food from another plant. So clustered broom rape is a parasite. And it's, in my experience, parasitizing fringed sage, which you can see a little bit in the background there. It's quite common. It's an annual, in fact. So it moves around every year and then puts up in this, usually in June, puts up these little pink plants that are essentially nothing but flowers.
It's just
so it is an annual.
It is an annual.
And it comes up from seed every year.
Yep. And so if you dig down into one, it doesn't really have a root system like a normal plant. It's just kind of a bulby, hard thing down there. So it's somehow, it's connecting itself to the roots of another plant. And I haven't explored that far enough to know exactly what's going on down there. One year I'll get around to digging them up and studying them more.
But you've really
Since
correlated
it's not green, it does.
sagebrush.
Sorry, Jeremiah?
You've correlated this mostly with fringe sage, so it needs to be in the area with fringe.
Yes, as far as I know, but I could be wrong. In my experience, some of these parasites are picky, and sometimes they're not picky about their host, so I'm not sure. But because fringe sage is practically everywhere in Wyoming, you can almost always find some somewhere near where you find clustered broomrape. Did you have a question, Jeff?
No, I was just going to comment that it does look a little bit alien since it's not green.
Yeah,
So
it is.
parasitic.
Yeah.
Each time you notice
It's
it,
not right.
kind of freaks you out. But then, and oftentimes you'll just notice, you won't notice it at all, and then you'll notice one, and then you'll start looking around, and they're like, they're everywhere. So it's part of being aware.
And it's
Is this
not
one
a
of
very
those
big
plants
plant.
that will launch its seeds?
What was that, Jeff?
That will what?
Is this one of those plants that launches its seeds?
No.
It produces
Okay.
a lot of seeds because being an annual, a lot of the annuals, they dump out the seed, right? Because that's their survival mechanism.
Yeah. So this plant's in the family called Orobanchaceae, and there's another genus in that family that we're all a lot more familiar with, and that's Castanea, or the Indian paintbrushes. Orobanchaceae is a family of parasites, and paintbrush is also a parasite. Although you can see it's green, it is capable of photosynthesizing. It's usually called a hemiparasite, meaning it's only half parasitic, in that it can produce its own sugars, but it has, like Orobanchaceae, it has lazy roots. And so it just grows down into the roots of another plant and sucks water and nutrients out of the host plant. The paintbrushes often are associated with sagebrush as well, and that may have a lot to do with the fact that sagebrush has really efficient root systems. So if you live in a drought place, that's a good plant to stick yourself to. But they aren't that picky in my experience with who they'll associate with. And it kind of just depends on the habitat. So if, for example, I have paintbrushes growing in a garden here on campus, and as far as I can tell, they'll associate with absolutely anything. The host plants die and the paintbrush stays alive, so it's on something else too. There's about 14 kinds of paintbrush in the state, and the one that is officially our state wildflower is the species Linaria folia.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's kind of some reds, there's oranges, right? Yellow paintbrushes.
Yep, whites, pinks.
White, pink, yep.
And I gather, Dorothy, that the Indian paintbrush can be kind of hard to ID in the field sometimes. Is color a reliable guide for telling who's who?
Not at all, because some of the species vary all over in color, from red to yellow. And the flowers are a little hard to use. If you look at closely at this picture, you can see that the flowers are these green tube-like things sticking out, and the color is actually coming from bracts, which are modified leaves. And the flowers aren't brightly colored, and they're weird flowers, and so botanists have strange names for the parts of these flowers, so keying them out can be a little complicated sometimes.
So Dorothy, we have a kind of comment question on the Q&A. There's a person who's been looking everywhere for paintbrush, but no one seems to know where the Berry Center paintbrush garden got its plants. So that would be your garden. Do you want to comment on that?
So it's been a while. I'll have to see if I can remember. We originally were able to buy 2 species from one of the nurseries in Denver. So we had to drive down there, and we were able to get Silky and Integra from the nursery.
Was it LaPorte Nursery?
No, it was a Denver one.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I don't remember now which one. And we brought them up and we kind of experimented with planting them with fringe sage and a couple species of Penstemon. And whatever we planted them with, they were successful. They did fine. Since then, we've expanded the diversity of paintbrushes in that garden, but that's because I've been growing them from seed and putting them out there.
So we have an article about growing Indian paintbrush. If anybody wants to see it, I'll point it out later. But paintbrush, it's actually pretty easy to collect the seed. They produce a lot of seed.
Yeah, they seem to germinate readily. It's not hard at all to get a paintbrush seedling. The hard part is when you go to move them into the garden and you just kind of have to hope that it'll make that connection with a host plant.
Yep. And some people try to do it in the pot. So they try to grow the host plant and the paintbrush together. So there's different approaches that you can use to try it.
Well, great, Dorothy. And I think that's the end of our show, or of your slides anyway.
Yep.
So if you want to stop sharing your slides for a little bit, I have a quick question to follow up. You offered some good resources for people that are interested, maybe getting into plant. Do you have any other resources or guides that would be very good for people enthusiasts in the native plants?
Well, I'm going to let Jenny take that question because she's got it all queued up here to talk about resources.
I'll do that. So here's some of the ones that we have. So on that Barnyards and Backyard site that we usually mention in the show, we have a page that you can click on called Native Plants. So you can just click on that and you'll see a bunch of different kind of subject headers here. And under identification, you can find various resources to help you figure out what you're looking at. So that includes things like some of the guides that will show you pictures. There's other ones from the USDA that cover almost all the plants in the US, a whole bunch of them. And there's also the Rocky Mountain Herbarium. Do you want to talk a little bit about the herbarium, Dorothy?
Sure. The herbarium database is a really nice resource to find out where plants are, but you have to be comfortable with scientific names because that's all that you can use to.
So I often use this site and it's super helpful. If I'm going to say go camping somewhere, I will put in the county and the state, Wyoming, of course, and then the county I'm going to be in, or you can draw little polygons on and pick out a certain part of the state that you want to see if botanists have collected certain plants from it. So you can make a little polygon for the area you want to go visit, and then you say show checklist, and this thing will crank out a checklist of the different plants. But as Dorothy said, it helps to be more comfortable with scientific names of plants when you look at them. But it's super nice to go out on a camping trip or something, have a list all there for plants so you can look at, so you can narrow them down.
So when you say a checklist, you're actually meaning the names of the plants. It's
yes.
not pictures or descriptions or
nope. It's just the names.
Okay.
So, but if you know an Indian paintbrush, one for the other, and you know it's Castolesia, then you can narrow it down to it helps you narrow them down to the species it might be. So it's kind of cool if you're into plants a little bit.
On the Rocky Mountain Herbarium website, not just that search page you saw, but at their website, we now have a downloadable spreadsheet that includes common names for everything.
Great.
So you could use that to work back and forth. Again, it may not be the common name that you're familiar with, though, and so that can be a little tricky, but it helps.
We do have some resources that we put together from plant walks. They're mainly around Laramie and Carbon County, so we'll try to increase it as we go along. But they're little cheat sheets that have information, basically just a picture of the plant and then the name of it. So if you're into that, that's a useful resource. Some other things that are on here include the Rangeland Plants. This is a publication that basically goes through a lot of the different plants. It's available for free online from Extension. And so you can flip through here and look at grasses and trees and shrubs. And a lot of the forbs are in there as well if you're interested in those types of plants.
And the forbs are mainly what we consider the flowers, right?
Yes. So rangeland folks always say forbs. When they say forbs, they're usually talking about a flower, sometimes Not the shrubs. Some other things that are on here. So we had a lot of folks that were typing in the chat box. They wanted information on how to grow different plants in their landscapes. And so this portion of that page is useful, the growing portion. So here's that article I was talking about on Indian state brush, or Indian, excuse me, paintbrush, state flower and challenge to cultivate.
You were almost technically correct, Jamie.
State brush. I don't think it's quite tall enough, but maybe. So we also have some other articles, including ones starting plants from seed. But we also have that publication that I was talking about with Dorothy that we wrote. That's on plants with altitude. So they're regionally native plants that you can grow in your garden. And so you can go in here, you can pull up the section on forbs, so it's flowers. So it lists all these different flowers on the side, and you can pull up each one and get some information about it, such as where it's native to, some different growing information, how tall it gets, stuff like that. We also had some questions that had to do with where do I get the seed? Where do I get the plants? Which is can be a problem with native plants. The nurseries are getting better, having more of them available in stock, but others are harder to find. And so if you go in here, you can find a page on seed sources where it lists a whole bunch of different seed sources. And so how we got that page was we asked natural resource people across the state, where do you get your stuff from? And so what they told us we fed together and put in that page. Then we also have ones on regional nurseries where people can go and find native plants. So those are some of the resources on that page, our native plants page, that you might find useful.
Great. Well, and there's other resources out there that are outside of the university and you can pick them up at bookstores and things like that. A couple I have on my shelf. If you want to stop sharing the screen. Yep. One I have is, so especially if you live in the northeast corner of Wyoming, I have Plants of the Black Hills and the Bear Lodge Mountains. And so that's a really good book for over there by Devil's Tower, Sundance area, things like that. The other one that I picked up that I really enjoy, this has been an excellent book, is The Flora of the Yellowstone. And so it's another good guide, especially for they're more of I would call it a novice plant guide. Very good pictures in them. They have characteristic descriptions in them. They do have the scientific names and things like that in there, but it's fairly user-friendly books. You can also use those books, even though like that one that said the Black Hills and the Bear Lodge Mountains, you can use that book down there in the Snowies and down there towards Laramie, but just not every plant down there is probably going to be in that book. And definitely not every plant's going to be in those books when there's 3,000 plants that you mentioned, Dorothy, are in the state of Wyoming, right? Vascular plants that we have. So
there's also a super one that's by Jack and Diana States, who live around Lander. That's called Wildflowers of Wyoming. It's a super one for those that are just beginning to get, especially those that are just beginning to get into flowers in Wyoming. You can find a lot of them in there, and it'll really get you started down the right road. Do you have any other resource you would suggest, Dorothy?
Well, I can mention the Vascular Plants of Wyoming again. Here's my beat up copy.
You can tell it's been
well used. The one that's the key, right? And it's not a picture book, it's a textbook. But yeah, if you really want to know what you have, this would be the only one that's got everything in it. Whereas the picture guides are great, of course, but those things are not in them just because of limited space.
So
and then you have to pack multiple of them, and it can be challenging when you're in the field.
Speaking of that, somebody just said that the Flora of Yellowstone has a great app for the phone too, where you can search by easy things like color, blooming month, number of petals, etc. Easy to use, quick to use in the field. So there's lots of resources out there to help you get started.
Well, I think that's everything. Is there anything else that we didn't cover, Dorothy?
Well, yeah, the other 2,900 species.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for your time and being willing to be on the show. It was excellent to hear about these few plants that are growing in Wyoming. And we just want to share with you, Jenny already showed the Barnyards and Backyards website, so great resources there. Please check that out, and please use that. The other thing is on that website, that same website, we have future shows for the Barnyards and Backyards Live, and then past shows. So we're recording this show. Once we're done and edit it, we will put it back up on that website. So you can watch it again if you wanted to see something or didn't catch something, or if you want to share that out. The other thing, Jenny, if you'd pull up that webpage for the Biodiversity Institute, please connect down with them on campus down in Laramie, the Biodiversity Institute. They have this website here, and it's just wyomingbiodiversity.org is their URL. So great resources on there. Connect with them. They're also the other resource of the herbarium. Those are resources available to you in the state that are down on Laramie campus. And the last thing, as always, we want to hear from you. Jenny has probably put already in the chat box an evaluation link in the chat box here in the Zoom meeting. She's also put it in the comments section in the Facebook Live. But if you're joining us via Zoom, once you close out of this, you'll be prompted in an internet browser to fill out that evaluation. If you can take some time and give us some feedback on the show, we'd really appreciate it. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Dorothy, again. You guys have a great day.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Jenny,
Dorothy.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Bye.
Bye. Happy wildflower hunting.